Bloody Sunday, a true story from the Civil Rights Movement by Todd Olson.
It was a time of terrible violence and racism against Black Americans. Unfair laws and violent police officers stopped millions of Black Americans from using their right to vote. Then one day in 1965, 25-year-old John Lewis led 600 peaceful protesters onto a bridge in Selma, Alabama. What happened next would change our country forever.
Segregation. The act of keeping people of different races separate from each other. Until 1954, segregation kept Black kids out of many schools in the South. Literacy. The ability to read and write. To improve her literacy, Sam visits the library often. Register. To put your name on an official list. Isaac had to visit the school office to register for his class. Civil rights. The rights that every person should have, no matter his or her sex, race, or religion. Susan B. Anthony fought for women's civil rights, such as the right to vote. Discrimination. Unfair treatment of others based on differences in such things as age, race, or gender. Riley was sure she wasn't hired because of discrimination she faced as a woman.
It was 3 p.m. on Sunday, March 7, 1965. 25-year-old John Lewis led the way onto the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Behind him were 600 protesters walking peacefully, 2 by 2. Their goal was to march 50 miles to the state capital of Montgomery. There, they would demand one of the most basic of freedoms, the right to vote. Halfway across the bridge, Lewis stopped in his tracks and stared ahead. He saw a wall of blue, dozens of Alabama state troopers in uniform. Behind the troopers were more men in regular clothes. They carried clubs the size of baseball bats. Lewis wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he knew it could put lives at risk. He also knew it could change the course of history.
So Alabama is a state in the southern United States. It's between Georgia and Mississippi, just above the Gulf of Mexico. So Selma is about 50 miles from Montgomery. Montgomery is the capital of Alabama. Selma to Montgomery. 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday, about 3,200 people started the Selma to Montgomery March again. By the time they got to Montgomery, the crowd had grown to 25,000. A powerful message. The civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr., spoke to the crowd in Montgomery at the end of the march. The crowd included many young people, like Bobby Simmons, 18 above, who dreamed of a better future. And if you look at this picture here, so here's Dr. Martin Luther King, he's talking, and right next to him, down here, this is John Lewis. And that's Bayard Rustin. There's Coretta Scott King. And other famous people were there as well. A nation demands change. People across the country protested in their own cities. The protests led to change. In August 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. And this is one of the most important laws for improving voting rights for Americans in the history of the country. So we march with Selma.
A basic right. The march that day in Selma wasn't unusual. For years, Black Americans had been protesting to end segregation. They had won the right to go to the same schools as white people. They had gotten rid of whites-only restrooms and lunch counters. Now they were fighting the next big battle, protecting their right to vote. They shouldn't have had to fight at all. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave Black men the right to vote, but across the South, officials found ways around the law. Black people had to pass impossibly hard literacy tests before they could register to vote. Even if they passed, they still had to pay a fee called a poll tax. As a result, by the early 1960s, only 1 in 5 Black Alabamans were registered to vote. Filling the jails. John Lewis started working for voting rights in Selma in 1963. He was just 23, but he had grown up going to segregated schools. He had been fighting for civil rights since he was 18. In Selma, Lewis helped Black people try to register to vote. Most of them were turned away. Sometimes they were thrown in jail simply for standing in line on the sidewalk. In 2 years, only 100 people were allowed to register. In January 1965, some people decided they had had enough. Day after day, hundreds lined up peacefully to register. Police took them to jail, jabbing them with clubs. In jail, they had to sleep on a cement floor with no blankets. But getting arrested was actually the goal. The protesters wanted to fill Selma's jails until they made the news. Hopefully, other Americans would notice and join the call for change. Then, in February, a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot to death by police. He had been trying to protect his grandfather. At Jackson's funeral, a plan was made. Protesters would march from Selma to Montgomery. To get there, they had to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Battle on the bridge. On the bridge that Sunday, the troopers gave Lewis and the marchers 2 minutes to turn around. Then they charged. Lewis heard the clunk of boots on the pavement. He heard the clip-clop of horses' hooves. He heard a woman yell, "Get him!" A trooper swung his club at Lewis's head and Lewis went down. I thought, "This is it," he said later. "People are going to die here. I'm going to die here." The attack lasted 10 minutes. Troopers swept through the crowd, swinging their clubs. Men on horses trampled protesters when they fell. When it was over, men, women, and children lay on the street bleeding. At least 60 people were injured. Lewis was left with a broken skull. Victory at last. Victory at last. That day on the bridge became known as Bloody Sunday, and it made America pay attention. Protesters filled the streets in 80 cities. Hundreds of people arrived in Selma, hoping to continue the march. President Lyndon B. Johnson promised to protect the marchers this time. On March 21, 3,200 marchers left Selma. They crossed the bridge safely. 4 days later, they marched into Montgomery. And 5 months later, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act. The new law made discrimination against black voters illegal. In less than a year, 8,500 new black voters were registered in the Selma area. A final message. John Lewis died this summer at age 80. After his work in Selma, he served as a congressman for 34 years. Even then, he didn't stop protesting. He led sit-ins and warned that some states still make it hard for Black Americans to vote. Just a few weeks before he died, Lewis returned to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. He had a message for young Americans that day. Speak up, speak out, get in the way, he said. We got to make America better for all of her people.